Good evening, everyone. Thank you. We're a little bit late, and a little traffic issues going on in Denver. Surprise, surprise. So thank you for your patience. Welcome to Elevate Ethics 2016, a dialogue on the state of ethical leadership in American business today. We're delighted to have you join us this evening for what I know will be a robust and very interesting conversation. I'm Dan Sweeney, the director of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics here at the University of Denver, Daniels College of Business. The Institute, as well as this particular event, could not be possible if it weren't for the generosity of our sponsors and the support of our partners. You've been seeing a loop of their logos and brand marks and so on. But I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce them to you formally now. We have two charter partners. CoBank is our inaugural charter partner. They in fact help us get this institute underway about 5 years ago. Another charter partner is Level 3 Communications. They're helping the institute establish an electronic global footprint by giving us access to their global IP live stream platform. So this is being streamed globally. A couple of hosting sponsors that help us with individual programs: IHS Incorporated and the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative. We have a couple of program sponsors as well: CH2M Hill, Deloitte LLC, and a number of individual members and friends who have contributed to our work. Several important partners of the Institute include the Colorado chapter of the National Association of Corporate Directors, the Colorado chapter of the Financial Executives International, the Voices of Experience Speaker Series here on the Daniels campus, the University of Denver chapter of Net Impact, a global organization of MBA students, and Rock Solid Design, the company that supplies all of our graphics and video work and related material. I would also like to acknowledge the support of our colleagues here at the University of Denver and at the Daniels College of Business in the leadership team they represent. Mr. Doug Scrivener, the chairman of our Board of Trustees, is with us. Doug, thank you very much. And I know somewhere in the room is Doug's predecessor, the chair emeritus of the Board of Trustees, Trig Murin. Also, Dr. Brent Crite, the dean of the Daniels College of Business, will join us shortly. He's on some other college business right now. So why are we here this evening? We're all familiar with the reportage, the editorial opinion, the commentary on the blogosphere, regularly criticizing the current state of business ethics and the ethical leadership of our business organizations. Public opinion polls consistently report the low esteem in which our business institutions are held and the individuals who lead those institutions. But the public has very seldom had a chance to hear much from the business community on this issue. So far, it's been kind of a one-way conversation. It is our goal for Elevate Ethics to provide a forum and a voice for that discussion. We intend this dialogue to achieve three goals. First, to provide a platform for corporate leaders to comment on how they view the state of ethical leadership in business today. Secondly, to provide a forum for the exchange of ideas on the effective development of ethical leadership in our business organizations. And third, to help advance the case for high standards of ethical leadership in our business institutions. To help develop this dialogue and pursue these goals, we have three outstanding business leaders from 3 outstanding organizations with us this evening. Now, you can help us also develop this dialogue by participating in the conversation yourself. We will have several opportunities during the discussion for audience members to ask questions of the panel. We'll have a roaming wireless mic to help you be heard. Don't be shy. We need to make this at least a two-way conversation. We also have a skilled and articulate moderator to keep the discussion on point and moving along at a decent pace. Bill Heck. Bill Heck is the managing principal of the Harlan Group, a leading provider of performance and compensation consultancy services to public, private, and nonprofit organizations. In addition, Bill is the chairman of the Colorado chapter of the National Association of Corporate Directors. Bill also serves on the steering committee for the Institute for Enterprise Ethics, for which we are very, very grateful. Early in his career, Bill served as an officer in the United States Air Force on various policy staffs at the Pentagon and at the Air Force Academy. Bill holds an MBA from the University of Colorado at Boulder, but we won't hold that against him, at least not tonight. So please welcome to our Elevate Ethics 2016, our moderator, Bill Heck.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. I'm more than honored to be here tonight amongst these 3 very astute experts and very well-versed in the area of ethics. So I'm expecting a great conversation. Let me first introduce them, and then I will ask each a question to begin the evening. Deborah DeHaas with Deloitte. Deb's role with the firm as Vice Chair, Chief Inclusion Officer, and Managing Partner of Deloitte's Center for Corporate Governance provides her a breadth of experience in a global firm with over 75,000 U.S. employees and 200,000 employees globally. She deals with the definition and discipline around ethics in that setting, as well as having the opportunity to interface with client corporate directors as they wrestle with ethical oversight. Bob Sawinga, who is next to me, to my left. Bob taught accounting at Stanford, Cornell, and Yale, and completed a successful 10-year term as Dean of Cornell's Johnson Graduate School of Management. He was a member of the U.S. Financial Accounting Standards Board for 10 years, and he currently serves on the Board of Managers of the Partners Group Equity Fund and is completing 14 years as a member of the General Electric Board of Directors. Bob also served on the Augustana College Board of Trustees. Gary Barant, to my far left. Gary's distinguished career includes a 17-year term as Executive Director of ICANN, a $3 billion network of 80 international advertising and marketing communications agencies, President and CEO of Dentsu Young and Rubicon, CEO and founder of Young and Rubicon Severo Moscow, Chief Operating Officer of a French-American joint venture based in Paris, and presently adjunct professor at DU Daniels, teaching global marketing communications to graduate students. If you don't mind, I'm going to take a Mark Rubio moment and get a little bit of water. Thank you. Let me make some comments as frame up the conversation for tonight beyond which Dan just did. Recently, Forbes magazine wrote that the most important challenge to corporate America is integrity. Business has never faced the type of moral challenges that it faces in today's global economy. Cheryl Connor of Forbes writes, "The temptation to cut corners, omit information, and do whatever it takes to get ahead occur every day. Sadly, the theme becomes highly infectious, and soon people actually start to feel like lying a little, or stealing a little, or deceiving others, that is, acting without integrity. These practices erode the trust that needs to exist with employees, business partners, executives, shareholders, and communities. It has been proven that without trust, businesses will not be able to compete effectively, and they will eventually fail." So our focus tonight is on 2 dynamics. One is, what do business leaders think about this integrity challenge? Where and when does it exist, and how is it addressed? And what do business leaders think about the ethical standards and behaviors that exist in business today. Two very heady topics. With those two questions as guideposts for this evening's conversation, let me say that the panel encourages you to ask questions throughout our conversations. We want to be this evening to be an interactive event, so we will prod questions, and we have not placed any questions in the audience, by the way, so there's nobody who has been told to ask a question. And that is, the questions will will succeed after we after the three panelists answer questions that have been prepared. So without further ado, let me ask Bob Syringa, directly to my left, a question relative to ethics in the boardroom. Your experiences as an independent director and audit committee member of General Electric have provided you, I'm fairly certain, some key takeaways on how to keep a discussion on ethics top of mind with fellow board members. Would you mind sharing some of those with us, Bob?
Okay, be pleased to. I want to thank Dan and the Institute for the opportunity to be here tonight. And I am going to use GE as an example. I am not here to either try to put it in a special class, but it's because I know it well and because I think it does represent a very good board, and I hope you'll sort of agree the same way by the time we're done. The GE board is a very active and highly engaged board. And I want to use the events that take place during a typical year or during a typical transition period as a way of illustrating some of the opportunities that arise that we can talk about ethics. And in fact, how you set the agenda, what you talk about first, many of these kinds of relatively simple heuristics are very important in setting the stage for these kinds of conversations. So let me start with orientation. When I joined the board in 2002, the first event I went to was an orientation for board members. The first thing we talked about was the spirit and the letter. Now, I know that some of these types of books, this is the code of conduct as well as the compliance guidelines for GE, that sometimes you can have these types of books and they don't get used very much. When I was dean at the Johnson School right after the Enron issues, we had an Enron Code of Ethics book that was for sale at a charity auction. It drew $110. You could buy it on eBay for $10. The sad thing is, it was still wrapped in its original wrapper. It had never been opened, okay? So GE starts at orientation with this book. And we spent a lot of time talking about what was expected of me, as well as the leaders of GE, and also what was required of all employees that work for GE. And this book is a 60-page book, but there's, of course, a much more elaborate version that's available online. So it's called The Spirit and the Letter. It is something that's existed for over 120 years, gone through many changes, and it provides the basis for that kind of a sort of discussion. It is also available in other kinds of formats, and there's a lot of e-testing that goes on. So when somebody joins the firm, they have to go through the book, they have to go through a testing process, and they have to pass the test. If they don't, they get the joy of continuing to study the book and until they finally do pass. Okay? So that started it in terms of what is expected of everybody in GE. And it covers a wide range of activities, and if questions arise, I'll give you some indication of the kinds of topics that are here. They've tried to anticipate almost everything that can arise. Okay? Next thing is board meetings. GE board meets 13 times. They met 13 times in 2015. To some of you that may be a lot, to some of you that may be a few. When I teach corporate governance, I often ask students about that, whether that's how that fits with their priors. The first topic we talk about when we get into a session is essentially about ethics, about legal issues, regulatory matters, investigations, those kinds of issues. That sets the stage for a robust conversation, often led by general counsel, about what kinds of things are on the plate that we should be talking about. As we then move through the agenda, we start talking about other factors, including business development, mergers and acquisitions. In the last year, we had the major acquisition of Alstom, and we've had the major exit plan for GE Capital, where we have sold a very large amount of assets. Many of these same issues come up in that context. When you have a major merger, major integration of a acquisition, especially a global company, many issues of ethics, of compliance, a wide variety of these issues become very, very important. We then have other topics, but then what happens at the end is the reporting out of the meetings that took place prior to the board meeting for the audit committee and for the risk committee. And you can almost view these as bookends, that what happens is we start with these issues. There are some repeat conversations as we go through various other topics. And then finally, at the end of the day, as we go through the committee reports, and the work of a board is done in committees. That's where the work takes place. And so those committee reports are very important about not only the kinds of issues, but reporting out about the corporate audit staff, about what's going on with controllership, what's going on with legal staff, compliance, risk management. All of these kinds of issues are being discussed at the near the end of the board meeting, and it sort of bookends what that conversation is. Now, the other activities take place outside of the boardroom. The audit committee. I've been on the audit committee since 2002. We go through the same thing. We start exactly with the same kind of coverage of ethics and compliance and legal issues, investigations, these kinds of issues. In more detail, perhaps, than what goes on in the boardroom, but because we want to basically have ownership for this on behalf of the board, and we want to be able to frame it, in many cases make recommendations, provide information that may help the rest of the board. It's a 16-member board. The other board members come to grips with these particular kinds of issues. We also have various types of reporting to us. We have an ombuds report. There are over 400 ombudspersons in GE. They represent about 3,000 inquiries in a year. Takes about 43 days to process each one of those. We go through those because this is our way of taking the pulse of the organization. This is our way of trying to have people provide us with information, and those investigations, which are conducted by legal staff and by the corporate audit staff, provide us with information at very different levels, at a terrain level, the level on the ground, about what's happening with some of these kinds of issues. We also have a hot button where they can communicate directly with the audit committee and directly with the board. And we go through those as well. In the audit committee, we get about 400 to 500 of those a year. Now, we're talking about 300,000 employees located throughout the world, so just to put that in a little bit of context. And so the audit committee becomes another way where we have sort of the bookends of this process, and it provides us with a basis for an in-depth conversation about these kinds of issues. Beyond the boardroom, in addition to the committee meetings, we do site visits. We go visit the businesses of GE. Each board member is expected to do 2 or more. Some do as many as 6. I've done as many as 6 in a year. And in doing this, we end up going to the business. We spend time with the leadership, with the leaders. We go through a complete business review without the top management being there. We do a tour of the facilities. I like seeing jet engines being built. I like seeing large compressors. My favorite is the locomotives in Erie, Pennsylvania. So GE makes big things, and it's fun to go around with the people who are putting these together. And when you're walking and talking with them, that's when issues come up. That's when they have the chance to talk with you about something that's on their mind. So the touring is a very important part of that process. We usually cap one of these meetings with a fireside chat where there's a panel of 2 or 3 board members. We may have a presentation by somebody, or we'll have a town meeting where we'll sit like this and people will ask us questions, and what we would have is a number of employers. When I went to Durham for the jet engine plant, we had separate meetings with 30 at a time. We went around the room. They introduced themselves, said how long they had been at GE, where they came from, what kinds of things they were doing, and also explaining to us what all those white beings were that were out surrounding the plant. GE has a large solar farm that surrounds that plant, and they have sheep out there because they didn't want to kick things up against those solar panels by mowing all that grass. Okay, so these are the kinds of ways to put yourself in the context, to walk the terrain, so to speak, to feel the pulse of the organization by having basically people interact with you. Another one of these is conferences. Conferences take place with the corporate audit staff, which is a premier leadership program inside of GE. There are over 400 corporate auditors. I don't want to tell that to Deb because she might want to hire some. They basically do all the investigations, do all the work. About half of the work is on audit. About half the work is on operational excellence. And in fact, over time, it's had more. You were talking earlier, Deb, about technology. There's much more emphasis of technology because GE is going through a revolution in terms of what it's doing in digitizing all of its operations and basically reducing the number of ERP systems and building a robust system that they can use for analytics, for modeling, and for understanding how things operate. Building digital twins, not only of their equipment, but also of their operations. So these conferences also then provide a way of us being really able to interact with the workers, with the employees. They will walk around, they will tell you things, they will stop at different places. It's a little bit chaotic. We didn't have to sort of herd cats to try to get people back into a meeting, but that is a very important way to do it. And then the final one of these kinds of meetings really comes about because of the desire to interact with customers and to interact with investors. And so when we have the GE board meeting, which will be in 2 weeks, this night actually, on a Tuesday night, the meeting is on Wednesday. On the Tuesday night, we will have a dinner with about 1,000 customers. And you sit at a table with 8 to 10 other customers. You have a chance to mingle with them, to talk with them. Again, the whole idea from our standpoint is to get us into a position where we can talk with them and have conversations about their experience with the company, their experience with the products, what kinds of things they see as being on the horizon, trying to understand, even over dinner while you're eating and drinking, what's sort of going on. So my purpose here was really to try to give you a feel that this is a heavily engaged board. When you're doing all of these kinds of activities, most of the time is outside the boardroom, but it's there basically to help us understand this very complex business with very different markets and very different locations around the world, and to provide us with a way of trying to do that. So in summary, that's really what these opportunities are created by setting the agenda. They're created by getting out of the office, getting out of the 30 Rock, and getting, some of you will remember the 30 Rock series, right? We actually meet in that building. And basically ways in which we can have an understanding, feel the pulse of the organization and the customers and the partners that we sort of deal with.
Thank you very much, Bob. Deb, let me ask a question about Deloitte. Your experiences in a global firm with over 200,000 employees and 20,000 new hires each year, half of whom are new graduates. How do you build a culture inside of that kind of an organization that respects brand integrity? And how are ethical standards addressed in such a culture?
Great, thanks so much. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here this evening with such an esteemed group of panelists, and we're really proud to be one of the sponsors of this program. I'm also probably most proud I'm here as a DU parent tonight, so it's great. I know we have some students, including my son, in the audience tonight, so I'm feeling a little bit of pressure because my son is here this evening for sure. It really struck me, Bob, as you were talking about the GE way and how you bring employees on board, that there's a lot of similarities to what happens at Deloitte. And so for those of you, just a minute about Deloitte. We are a very large global professional services and consulting firm, 4 businesses, audit, tax, consulting, which would include technology consulting, strategy and operational consulting, and human capital consulting, and then an advisory business where M&A services, cybersecurity, data analytics, et cetera, happen. Of those roughly 200,000 employees, more than 75,000 of them are here in the U.S., and actually that 20,000 figure is actually just the number of U.S. employees that we'll hire. It's actually quite a bit more globally. And the demographics are sort of interesting. I'm one of the, I'm a 10%er. About 10% of our people are baby boomers, and about 55 to 60% are millennials. And so you can figure out where Gen Yers sit in the middle. So we have a very young, dynamic workforce, which is a very exciting thing. And if you think about our firm, we have a few computers and desks and chairs, but our greatest asset are our people. And so when you think about what we do at Deloitte, whether it's in our audit business or in the consultative services that we provide, our brand is everything to us. And we are delivering on that brand every day. Every single person inside Deloitte is a brand ambassador. And if we don't have a reputation that is based on trust and integrity and competence, we don't have a business. So it's really important that each one of our employees understands the importance of ethical standards and behaviors, the expectations of our firm. And one of the taglines that we use inside Deloitte is personal integrity, public trust. Similar to what you heard about GE, we do have a code of conduct, and that is something that we expect every one of our employees, as well as the most senior individual, our partners in our organization, to understand and embrace and understand how it impacts day-to-day behavior. So each of our employees is expected to have read the code of conduct, to understand it. We have a process whereby our employees have to represent formally back to the firm several times per year their adherence to that code of conduct. We have a series of training curriculum that are required trainings for each of our employees on ethical standards and behaviors, and we continue to update those. And we try to make those very real, sort of take it outside of the book, and some of it is very much kind of driven in an online virtual environment, but also real-time sort of in day-to-day activities. We do try to provide a lot of tools to our people, and because every day they are faced with ethical dilemmas and decisions, whether it's something they're doing at a client or something that's happening inside the office. And so we have a series of tools that they can use. We've actually created a series that we call Dr. Dilemma, and people write in dilemmas to our Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, and there are little vignettes that are played out and shared online. We also have a program where we have encouraged our employees and our leaders to send in personal stories, what we call defining moments, where they themselves have had to deal with an ethical issue and they explain the way that they've handled it. And one of the sort of more fun and creative things that we did, I'm from Chicago, and some of you may be familiar with the Second City, which is a comedy troupe. We actually engaged Second City to help make a series of videos in vignettes in a somewhat humorous way, albeit with real life issues that we share with our people, and that gives them some information on how that works. And then literally every year we go through and come back to our people, and we do a survey to them, asking them how they feel about the ethical character of our organization. And a couple of statistics that I feel are interesting and maybe give some comfort to us on how we feel our people are responding to this. So in our 2015 annual report on ethics and compliance, 97% of our people told us they felt prepared to respond to an ethical dilemma. 89% of them told us that they would most likely seek guidance for an ethical issue, either from their immediate supervisor or from someone in our HR or our legal organization. And we have also provided, because of that importance of the supervisor relationship, we provided a lot of training for our supervisors to know how to respond to those particular requests. We also have all the traditional methods. We have an integrity hotline. We have other forums where people can tell us things or ask questions about things that they're very concerned about. And one of the things that we do every year is we report back to them on how we have handled their inquiries or their complaints. And in our ethics report, we actually tell them how many ethics hotline requests came in. And we don't give them the specific resolution, but we tell them how many of them were resulted in some sort of a termination or some sort of an action that's taken. And I think one of the things we talk about a lot is just that kind of continued emphasis on tone at the top. And we really do expect the leaders of our organization, people like myself who sit in our leadership meetings or on our board, to walk that talk and to demonstrate those behaviors that we want our people to emulate. And one of the things that we do talk quite a bit is it's really important to have that tone at the top, because if you don't have that tone at the top, there's no way you're going to create the culture that's going to incent that behavior. But what probably is the trickiest part is how do you get to that group in the middle? And we call it, what's the mood in the middle? Because if you don't have the right mood in the middle, even though you might have a great tone at the top, it's not going to really permeate its way throughout the organization. And then that really kind of leads you to what we call that buzz at the bottom. What are you really hearing from your people? We have a number of mechanisms where we get feedback from our people, certainly in our annual talent survey and through a number of other mechanisms to understand those issues that are of great importance to them. So those are some of the things that we try to do. Just one other thing that we do on an ongoing basis, we are an organization that focuses daily on the professional development of our people. And those greatest learnings, of course, happen in the field and at clients, but we do actually have our own DU, what we call Deloitte University, in Dallas, Texas. So you have to be a little careful when you say you're going to DU. In our firm, it means you're going to Deloitte University. But we have a facility that we opened 5 years ago. It houses 800 people. We will do 1 million hours of training for our people in the U.S. at Deloitte University and 4 million hours of training in the U.S. Overall. And on average, our people go through about 75 to 80 hours of professional development every year. When they hit key milestones in their career at Deloitte, when they're a new employee, when they become a manager, a senior manager, as they get more supervisory experience, we send them to Deloitte University, and they go through experiential learning of what it means to be a Deloitte employee, what it means to be a manager of people. And we talk about what are those behaviors that we expect in leaders at that level. What are those ethical behaviors? With my inclusion hat on, what are those inclusive leadership behaviors that we expect? And we actually put them in real life learning situations and see how they respond. And to the extent that perhaps they didn't exactly get it right, we have very senior partners and other leaders who are there to help provide insights on perhaps what might have been a better response or path, and that's hopefully going to set the stage for how they'll behave on a day-to-day basis. So, I'd say in summary, we've got a lot of programs and processes. At the end of the day, it really does come down to our people. We do look to hire the best and the brightest. For you students, I will say that we do look at things like Facebook and social media, because we want to kind of get a sense of some of the things that you all are doing, and sometimes there's some red flags out there. And from an experience, there really is, and I certainly tell my kids that some of those social media posts don't really go away, so you need to really be careful. Your brand is that one asset that you should never give up. And the other thing that we do, certainly from an experienced hire perspective, the most successful experienced hires for us are those who get recommended by another Deloitte employee. We do provide incentives for employees to recommend people that they know and trust, that they feel meet our ethics, our values, our culture, and that's really been, I think, a critical part of our success.
Well, Deb, thanks. Before we go on to Gary, let me ask a question about, and hopefully you'll have a thought or an opinion. What is your sense about how ethics is handled by the new employees coming through Deloitte? Is it different than it has been in the past? Are there any markers, any indicators of difference?
I think, first of all, I'm really optimistic about our millennial generation. They are incredibly talented. One thing that's very important to them, I always hate to generalize, but we've done a lot of millennial surveys. One thing that they tell us is they want to work in an organization that they feel has a purpose. And they may want to work differently than some of us grew up wanting to work, but I think they really have a commitment to excellence. So I'm extremely optimistic and excited about the generation. And since they're going to pay for many of our retirements, I think who are in the room, hopefully we all share that optimism. I think one of the challenges, I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit more, in today's environment, things move very fast. There's a transparency that this generation has, and there's a lot of sharing, and that's, I think, a really admirable quality, but I think some of the lack of experience at times is something that we have to temper. And so, we're in a business where, again, we have access to a lot of confidential client information. And our clients expect that, we are going to hold that sacred. So, the challenge is you've got an employee who's really excited to be on this new client, and they're in Atlanta, and they post that they're in Atlanta, and they're really excited to be working on, a big transaction at, a large consumer products company. Well, guess what? That might be pretty easy to connect the dots and have information out in the public domain. So as we get into some of these real life dilemmas that we show, we actually get really, really deep into things like confidentiality, some of the things that maybe, inadvertently people would do. And I think once they kind of understand that, but I think there's just perhaps, again, with any new employee, first time in the workforce, you just have to make sure that they sort of understand the rules of the road. But I'm, again, super excited and super positive about the future of our workforce.
Oh, great, thanks. Gary, let me ask, you've had a lot of global experience, and global experience where you've been on the hook for growth. Could you share with us and frame some of those ethical situations that might come up in that kind of a situation that perhaps you've experienced or that you've known about?
Thank you, Bill. Most of my career, I have worked internationally, either traveling abroad from Chicago or New York, or living abroad in Japan, Belgium, France, Singapore, and the old USSR. I've worked for big international companies like GE and big international advertising networks like Young and Rubicam, who had big international clients like AT&T and Kraft and Colgate and KFC. I've also worked for small agencies with small clients. I've come to believe through the years that most business leaders know the right thing to do. They know this from their formal education, from their religious training, or from their parents telling them right from wrong after a sibling has said, "That's not fair." I also believe the integrity challenge is different depending on where in the world you are sitting at the time. In other words, geography is probably more important to the ethics challenge than the size of the enterprise. Generalities are, of course, dangerous. My experience has been that the more developed the marketplace, the more sophisticated the community, the more integrity one finds in the business community and in the business leadership. Is this a function of universal education, of the religious influence, of the capitalistic system, or the rule of law put in place by politicians? Or is it a fact that there are more women involved in business leadership in those countries? Probably it's a combination of all those things. In developing countries, without these influences, business practices are often conducted the way they've been conducted for centuries. In some countries, the tribe you belong to, the caste you belong to, or the political party you belong to is more important than the title on your door. That's just the way it is. Conducting business in these developing countries as part of an American-based company and staying within the American business laws can be a challenge, and it can be a handicap. Companies from other developed countries do not contend with the same restrictions Americans do in these developing countries. Let me shift gears a bit and talk more about the ethics behavior. Someone once said, you get the behavior that you incentivize. If you would give a business leader the charge of growing a company, raising shareholder value, increasing the bottom line, and you promise a big bonus if they succeed, then practicing good business ethics can be a challenge or even a conflict. No business leader wants to be unethical, but he or she wants to prove to the board that they made a good choice by naming them CEO. They will do anything to meet the corporate objectives put before them and hopefully even exceed those objectives. They want that big bonus. They may have already spent it on that new house on the best part of town. This CEO is going to do whatever it takes to succeed, and if that means not doing exactly the right thing, well, that's where the challenge comes in. When the board lays out the annual goals for the CEO and the resulting rewards, they are typically laid out in financial terms. That's the way businesses keep score. There are no incentive rewards for ethical leadership. That's expected. But since this is usually not discussed, it may not be top of mind. Sustainability, clean air, equal opportunity are all good things, but bonuses are figured on the figures. If you miss your numbers, you might hang in for a year or two. But if there's a public ethics scandal, you may take the fall and be gone. Maybe in the middle of the night when you've just cut a safety corner, raised prices beyond reason, or fudged a performance figure, you may feel you've not done quite the right thing. But your bonus is based on the numbers you deliver. And there's that big new mortgage you have to worry about. Is this the way all CEOs operate? Certainly not. These are the violations that make the headlines. Yet I believe it is the focus on financial incentives that bring on most of these ethical challenges, not the lack of knowing the right thing to do. This is where boards must set the tone for an ethical corporate culture and enforce the standards of ethical corporate leadership. It's only good business. Just ask Volkswagen. If I may, Bill, I'd like to tell a couple of stories that illustrate how these ethical challenges can shift in different parts of the world. When starting up the first ad agency in the Soviet Union back in the late 80s, we needed to have a rare authorization to have a telex machine in our office. Now, for you youngsters, a telex machine is a form of international communication just above the telegraph.
Yeah.
And it was before fax machines were allowed in the Soviet Union. These devices that could communicate outside the Soviet Union were strictly controlled. Authorization for our telex was taking an extraordinary amount of time. So I asked one of our Soviet joint venture partners to check and see what was going on. And he came back and he said, there's a lady bureaucrat who refuses to sign our authorization. I said, why is that? And sheepishly he said, she wants a blue cashmere sweater. We immediately bought her a blue cashmere sweater, and the authorization for the telex arrived the next day, and we were communicating. This is the way business was done in the Soviet Union in those days. This lady was probably the best-dressed bureaucrat in all of Moscow, since businesses were coming in from all over the world to take advantage of this new market opportunity with all its possibilities. Fast forward a few years. In the mid-90s, when I was running the Asia-Pacific region of Young and Rubicam, our largest global client was entering a big new market that they had not been in before. And it was a market that was known for corruption. And they wanted us to be in there with them, and they wanted us to be in there fast so we could help them with their advertising needs. I went to that market and met with what was purported to be the most reputable law firm and get the process started of beginning a business. The senior partner of that law firm said, "Do you want to do this slow through the bureaucracy, or you want to expedite it?" I said, "Yeah, I want to expedite it." He said, "That will cost more." Then he said, "You know, you must have a board with local members." I said, "Okay, that's fine. We can do that." He said, "One of your board members is going to be a member of the ruling family and demands quite a high director's fee." Naively, I said, "Well, does he know anything about advertising?" The lawyer said, "It doesn't make any difference. You'll never see him." In the interest of getting the agency up and running and keeping our biggest client happy, I agreed. A year later, a representative of that same government from that same country came to see me. I was working in Singapore at the time. And he said, "Would Y&R like to compete for our country's national airline account?" I said, "Sure." It would mean business throughout all of our 28 agencies in the region. I said, "Great, we will be happy to do that. When do you want us to come present our ideas?" He said, "You don't need to present your ideas. You just need to give me an envelope that demonstrates how bad you want this business." I declined. Another non-US based agency network did win that business, I assume with an envelope and not a great plan to increase traffic on that airline. Was the boss of that agency wrong? Depends on your perspective. His company culture may have said, "Take the account, grow your business, give bonuses to your staff, and you will get a handsome bonus yourself." The envelope for them was the cost of doing business and would be deducted from the first year's income. Was his integrity in question? No, not really, not there. Nor was the fact that he paid his local female staff half of what he paid his local male staff for doing the same job. He probably sleeps just fine. Would he take a few coins out of a blind beggar's cup to buy a newspaper? No, not at all. That would be unethical. The point I'm trying to make here is that business ethics are relative and depend on where you're doing business. This is particularly true in growing markets in developing countries. local entrepreneurs that have seen how developed countries do business want to do business that way and want to catch up fast. But they are also often continuing to use the same business practices that they have used for centuries. One more story, Bill, if I may. In China, in the late 90s, we opened the first ad agency in Shanghai. And we wanted to get some positive press in the Chinese newspapers. We planned a press conference, but then our Chinese joint venture partners told us if we want to get our press release published, we have to distribute it with a small red envelope with some money in it. And it wasn't a lot of money, it was basically the cost of a good lunch. We did, and the next day our press release appeared in every paper exactly how we had written it. Basically, we had bought an ad. In the West, such a red envelope with a news release would have been rejected by the press. In fact, it may have resulted in some negative articles about our company. By the letter of the law, would these small extortions be in violation of the American business laws? And would our integrity be questioned? Yeah, perhaps. But probably not for the amounts of money that were involved. Does this still happen today? Yeah. But not at the same extent. These markets develop, as these markets develop, they strive to protect their Western investments. Local business leaders will follow the ethical practices of their joint venture partners and their new bosses from the West. However, ethical behavior also depends on local political leaders. If the head of the government is on the take, unfortunately, that attitude of corruption filters down into the business community. When working abroad, American companies must try to follow American business laws, clearly. Even if their competitors do not, and even if that puts them at a competitive disadvantage. Major bribes or expedient appointments, as we've seen in the press, are eventually found out. Careers are ruined, corporate reputations are destroyed. But with a blue cashmere sweater, not so much.
Gary, thank you very much. Thoughts and comments and questions that may have been developed from the stories told and the comments made by the panelists. Yes, ma'am.
I didn't have to buy a blue cashmere sweater to get a toilet. I needed Snickers and jeans.
Snickers and jeans.
Snickers and jeans. That's my paperwork when I was in the late 80s in Moscow.
Yep.
I
You were,
got off, I think, cheaper than you.
you did. You were a better negotiator.
That's not an ethical standard we want to pursue, by the way.
Well, I found out in law school that I actually violated the freedom, or the Foreign Practices
Yep.
Act.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think the statute had run by that.
Yes. It's been 7 years since any of those stories happened, so I think we're safe.
Other thoughts or comments, questions? Yes, ma'am.
Nowadays, it's becoming common practice for publicly traded companies to use financial engineering for buybacks and dividends to kind of show that their stock is doing a little better, So just wanting to know from a board of directors what your thoughts are on that. A lot of people I'm a former Wall Streeter, and to me that has always been poor management, money that could have been used through R&D or probably something else. Why is the board of directors kind of supporting that kind of behavior, and where is this going?
The issue that you're really raising is what's called capital allocation. and how the companies make the investments in R&D, how they make it in various types of equipment and locations and so forth as part of their operating base, what decisions they make about dividend yields and so forth as time goes on. And there is a literature, as you noted, that really supports buybacks as a way of distributing cash back to shareholders without raising the dividend, which then leads you to having a floor on the dividend, and it can only increase in the future. And so it's to try to obtain additional degrees of freedom in that capital allocation process. Unfortunately, or more fortunately, in many cases, it does work exactly the way you described, that there are segments of the market that want, like a liquidity put, that they want to have some cash coming back to them. And so this provides them with that. You're seeing that right now with the General Electric exit plan for GE Capital is going to release a tremendous amount of capital inside that GE then is going to distribute back to shareholders in one form or another. But in doing that, the decision is made only after they've looked at what their research needs are, what they are going to need, and they have a huge research budget. And they will continue to do that because the next generation of jet engines, the next generations of locomotives, digital processing, lighting, all this type of thing requires major investment. And so there is an overall process that's a strategic process, and at GE, the board participates in that process through board meetings that are designed to focus exactly on that kind of issue. Once we have a plan in place, the growth playbook type of terminology is used, we then try to see whether we can stay with that plan. But you're absolutely right. It's one of those levers in the process, and as you noted, there are views on both sides, legitimately so.
Deb, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, Bob, you did a great job of responding to it in a very holistic way. I do think that, you know, as I just look across many of the clients that I'm involved in, I mean, I do think that many organizations make a strategic decision when they truly believe their stock is undervalued, and that there's a very good, to your point, it's an appropriate allocation of capital. I think there is a heightened visibility to it, certainly, and I would say in the last 6 to 12 months, I think it is getting heightened visibility. I think as the activism agenda continues to expand, and I certainly don't see that diminishing at all. The money that's being put into those types of funds, I think, it continues to be on the upswing. Although not all have been successful, obviously, in some of their ventures or their investments. But and I think as boards and as management teams, there's going to be a continued strong expectation to really be taking a very hard look at the business, at its performance. Activism, I think, can be a very positive thing, because typically they're looking at a business in a way that is looking to make sure it's delivering the highest value to shareholders. Certainly there's a balance between short-term and long-term aspirations, and I think that's going to continue to be in the forefront of many of the decisions that companies are making now and in the future. I don't see that shifting at all.
Very good point
If I could just add one point. Another variable in this is that many companies have large amounts of stock options, which are dilutive.
Right.
And one way in which companies manage that dilution, to some extent, is by buybacks and using those treasury shares then to basically keep a rather level stock ownership base, if that's what they want to do.
Very good point. You can find that question of ethics in a number of corporate activities, especially in capital allocation. Other thoughts, questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
I had a question for Deb about Deloitte's practice of sharing ethics report data with employees. Particularly since there's such a large portion of your workforce that are millennials, who, from what I read, like data, like transparency. So I have a two-part question for you. First, was there any hesitancy among leadership about sharing that data, or was it an obvious, simple choice? And secondly, have you received any feedback from your workforce about whether they pay attention to those figures, whether they like the transparency, and value getting that information as employees?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say certainly the first time we did it, we did have a conversation around how transparent should we be. And, there's various levels of transparency, right? And so certainly I was a member of our board for 2 terms, and the level of transparency with our board, would have been at a more in-depth level than what we would do with our overall population. But, really the intent of that was to send a very important message, which was that we, first of all, we expect people to act if they see something that does not meet our values and our standards. And we really wanted them to know that those actions were taken very seriously. And in some cases, there wasn't an issue, and therefore there was no termination or other action taken. In certain cases there were. And we never got into specific examples of individuals, but it was clear that we did talk about the types of actions that were taken, whether they were reprimands, whether they were termination, et cetera. I do think what tends to happen in many organizations is there is sometimes a little bit of water cooler talk, and it's not always a bad thing, right? Sometimes there is value in people knowing that, gee, that action, that person is no longer with the organization, because that reinforces the culture and the tone that you are trying to set. So I think I answered the first part. I'm not sure if I answered the second part of your question. Maybe you could restate that piece. Was that?
The second part was, do you have any feedback from employees about whether they're paying attention to data, valuing it?
Yeah.
Because sometimes you get lost in the noise, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, we have it online and we have a report, but what we do tend to do is we take other forums to make that an opportunity to share that type of information. So, for example, in our audit practice, we have an annual sort of technical excellence training, and our Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer will show up at, those types of meetings and share some of that information. And I think they do appreciate really knowing not only that kind of information, they really are looking for our leaders to be more transparent in many things. And certainly, I think if you looked on sites, whether it's Glassdoor or other sites that have information around salaries and other things, I think you would see that perhaps this generation is looking for more transparency in many respects: compensation, opportunities, things like ethics and compliance, et cetera. So it is something we think about. I think one thing we do know is that almost any information that you put inside an organization, it's going to be outside in seconds, literally seconds. And so you have to be thoughtful around, how much you do share, and that's why this issue of client confidentiality and all those other things is super important. And we have a lot of processes around how we try to, protect that information that is put into our care.
Great question. Yes, sir, on the aisle.
This is also a question for Mr. Haas. I was struck by the figure in your survey that 97% of your people are prepared to deal with an ethical dilemma. 2 questions. First of all, can you identify those 3%, or do they cause nightmares? And secondly, how do you measure whether one is prepared to deal with an ethical dilemma?
Yeah, it's a great question, and again, this is our people's perception, right, of how well prepared that they feel. So it is a little bit hard to measure. But having said that, we are an organization that we do trust, but we verify. So we do have, as part of our normal processes, we have a number of compliance types of actions that we do take to, in fact, ensure that our people are adhering to some of our our requirements around whether it be ethics in our profession, independence is extremely important around your financial holdings and other things. So we do a lot of tests around that. I think how we do try to get comfort is, should we feel good about that or not, is what do we actually see in the field, and how do we see our people behaving, and do we need to flag some of those things that perhaps we don't see happening that we feel are appropriate. So that's certainly something that we continue to look at. And I think we also realize that in this world that is changing really dramatically, and the velocity of change and just some of the aspects, again, of social media and technology, things that we may have shared with them 5 years ago, and they were prepared to deal with ethical dilemmas as business changes and as our role continues to evolve in how we serve clients. Some of those ethical dilemmas, may change. Some are very timeless. How do you treat people? How do you, how do you keep information confidential? Some other things are going to be very different. So we have to continue to look to evolve and change and make sure that we understand what are currently best practices. And in terms of how we work with clients, we actually work with a lot of clients around their ethics and compliance programs, and we are constantly looking for those best practices and what we can learn and then bring back to our own organization and see how we can continue to get better. So it's an ever learning type of situation.
Thank you. Let me ask a question, if you might, to the panel. Recently, a number of pharmaceutical companies have implemented strategies of substantial price increases for prescription drugs on which millions of patients' lives depend. This involves respected and established traditional big pharma companies like Bristol Myers and Pfizer. What is your take, going to some of the comments that you made, Gary, as well as the other two panelists? What is your take on how this activity may be rationalized in light of the ethics of pricing strategies? What are some of the triggers?
Well, I'm not sure it can. I think some of these longtime respected companies may lose some of that respect if they dramatically raise their prices on drugs that are life-saving or life-critical. It is, yes, they can say, we're doing this for our bottom line, we're doing it for our shareholders, but I think they have to look very carefully before they do that, because they may, in the long run, damage the corporate reputation for all of their products.
Bob, what would be the thinking at the board level if that conversation were to be had?
Well, I think the firms are going to argue, and they have argued, that they have the right to do this. That in today's world, at least in the United States, it's not illegal. And they will rely on markets, and I'll come back to that. The other question is to seek to maximize shareholder value. They will say that as well. That's part of the rationale for doing this. It may be in the short run, but they're looking at maximizing shareholder value in the long run as well. I found a wonderful quote. Bill shared that he was going to ask a question along those lines. It's Potter Stewart. And it's ethics is knowing the difference between what you have a right to do and what is right to do. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the issue here. That in terms of, yes, they may have the right to do that, and I agree with what Gary said. But I think that the issue here is that what they're going to do is that they're going to capture a number of individuals who are patients, who have prescriptions, who are a captive audience. They may not be able to find a substitute. They may not be able to find other alternative treatments. And so all of a sudden, they're caught in the crosshairs here, and they're the ones who are on the other side of this. J&J, for many, many years, has had a credo. And the credo is a hierarchy in terms of who they seek to really respond to and to be accountable to, as well as to benefit. And there are 4 layers. The first layer is doctors, nurses, and patients. The The second layer, employees. The third, communities. And the last one is shareholders. It's a complete inversion of the way we normally think about shareholder value. And they've had this for many, many years. They start every presentation. We've had the CEOs come to Cornell Business School to make presentations, and the first thing they do is talk about that credo. And I've been at J&J at various times, and I find that it comes up in their conversations as well. And I also was a colleague of mine was Ralph Larson, who died in March, who was a very good senior executive, and that was part of his DNA. And so I think somewhere along the way we will probably have this type of debate again. And in fact, now a party who is going to pay for a lot of this is going to be the federal government, right?
Right.
Through health care. And so there is going to be some tension here, and it's going to be interesting to see what's going to play out over a long period of time. But I think that's the kind of arguments we'll hear from these companies. We did hear from the first one. They were not the Pfizer and the Bristol Myers, but the first one who did that says, well, I have the right to do it, and I'm just out there maximizing shareholder value. You should be applauding me rather than
I believe
attacking
he's
me.
in jail now.
I think he is, yes. Or he was for a while in a way.
You know, I think, Bob, to that point, though, so much of what you just said, and you know, when you do walk into J&J, I mean, the credo's right there. And I do think so much of how these conversations get based on is back to, you know, what are our core values? And what do we stand for? And, you know, one of the things I always tell young people or people who are looking to join an organization is, you know, when you go to the website, one of the most important things you can do is understand what are the core values, and then as you talk to people, try to understand whether or not they really live those. I mean, are they real, or are they just nice words that, you know, are sitting on a website? Because, you know, if you go to an organization and your core values aren't aligned with what that organization stands for, and you think you're going to change the organization, unless it's a pretty small organization and you're a majority of the organization, you know, you're going to find yourself in a really, really unhappy place. And one of my colleagues uses a phrase that is sort of similar to one that you talked about, and she talks about being on the right side of right. And you know, I think there's a lot to be said for that, and trying to figure out where that line is. And I think that in today's world, that line, sometimes it moves, sometimes it's really clear, and sometimes it's a little less clear when it starts to get gray. And when you start to get in that gray zone is where I think most of us really are challenged with those ethical dilemmas, Gary, that you told such, you know, compelling stories about, and that's why it makes this really, really hard.
At Y&R, we're often asked to write the mission statement or the corporate credo, and we always say the words are easy.
Actions
It's
are
the
hard.
how are you going to enforce it and implement it and inculcate it through the whole community of your company.
Very good point.
Can I go back to the questions that were raised about reporting back? I think is part of this conversation as well. That in order for the buttons on the website and on the audit committee website and on the ombudsman or ombudsperson sites, that those can only work if the DNA of the organization is that you do a fair investigation and that you share information back about what you learned. And in some cases, people have been giving awards, recognition awards, because of they identified a problem that nobody got let go. It was really a problem that was endemic in the organization, and nobody was dealing with it. And they were able to then deal with it. It also goes back to what Gary said, that when we look at the rates of who's responding and who's making inquiries across the nation, across the world, we find there are differential rates depending on
Absolutely.
countries and on certain cultures and societies. And we try to deal with that because somewhere along the way we have to have this very general openness, but also it's the trust and verify and provide the information back. So people, it's not just putting things into a hole and never hearing about it again. People want to know, and they want to know in a short period. That's why I said 43 days. We try to keep those days in mind, because too long, people become frustrated and anxious and concerned.
We had a question up, a gentleman up towards the top.
Thank you. With all of the energy and thought that a lot of smart people in your organizations put into the hiring process and then endeavoring to imbue every employee with the importance of ethical behavior. Do you think it's possible in a 200,000 person organization or even a 500 person organization to completely eliminate the possibility of a rogue employee doing something like covering up an ignition switch problem or something analogous depending on what your business does? And if there's one thing that is the antidote to winding up on the front page of the New York Times for all the wrong reasons, if there's one thing a business can do to avoid that happening, what do you think it is?
So is that question at me, directed at me? Okay.
I think it's a fairly hard question.
Yeah, it is a hard question. You know, I don't think it's possible in a large organization to say that you're not going to have someone who doesn't play by the rules. And, you know, disappointingly in organizations I've worked in, I mean, we've had certainly examples of that. Sometimes they've been people in high positions in the company. That's incredibly disappointing that you think someone could have, you know, moved up and somehow we hadn't identified that that person had a character flaw or something that, you know, caused them in that particular instance. You know, it's human nature. So I don't think it's possible to say never say never, right? I just don't think it's possible. I do think there's, I think many of the things that we've tried to do are probably, I don't think it's just one thing. I think it's a lot of different things. I think it's hard work. I think it has to be reinforced every day. I do think actions do speak louder than words, and so you can have a lot of really flowery and good policies, but if it doesn't feel real, if they don't see leadership doing it, that tone at the top is so important. If they don't see people being rewarded for doing the right thing or being, in fact, disincentivized or in fact terminated or really negative consequences of bad actions, I think it's hard to feel that you're not going to have issues. And I do feel like, Gary, your point around, you know, people, what gets measured gets done. Incentives are really important. So I think organizations have to continue to really think carefully around what messages they're sending, and to make sure that they really are recognizing and rewarding those behaviors that they think are critical. You know, before my time at Deloitte, I was at Arthur Andersen, and I was at Arthur Andersen until the end. And I know we've got a few other people either on the panel or in the audience who spent time at that firm, and that was a wonderful organization with a stellar brand for almost 90 years. And you know, a really small number of people were able to, you know, bring down that firm, and it was gone in a shockingly short period of time. Within, you know, 90 to 120 days, the firm was gone. And you know, I learned so much from having lived through that, and I think anyone who's lived through that and who's seen what happens when your brand gets damaged, and particularly again when you're in a business of providing trust and integrity, and that's what you stand for, I think you take those lessons with you. So I think about that every single day, and I know personally I think about, you know, how would I feel if we're on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, et cetera. You know, I used to say, how would my mom think about it? I still think about how my mom would think about it, but I think about how would my kids think about it, too, and what kind of role model would I be for them.
I don't think any approach to this can be 100% effective. And what I'd like to do is read a quote from Jeff Immelt in 2002 annual report. So this is right around shortly after the Sarbanes-Oxley sort of bill. One concern that keeps me up at night is that among the 300,000 plus GE employees worldwide, there are a handful who choose to ignore our code of ethics. I would be naive to assume that a few bad apples don't exist in our midst. We spend billions each year on improving our training, enforcing our compliance with ethical norms, and reinforcing our values, all to preserve our culture and to protect one of our most valuable assets, our reputation, which is what we've been talking about here. And, but I think that that does not dissuade me or others from trying to do the best we can. We know that some of these are not rational, deliberate actions or somebody has consciously decided to do that. They are in situations where there is interpersonal pressure, there may be difficulties, there may be a wide variety of circumstances that may lead to this behavior. Some of them came out in the WorldCom case, where two accountants in Mississippi were enticed to making a couple of journal entries that neither one of them wanted to make. But they did it to try to be helpful, and they ended up actually getting punished more than the ones who asked them.
Another question down here.
Well, thank you all for being here. My question is for Gary. With your geographical knowledge,
I guess you would have to say Watergate as an example of where our ethics and our behavior was questioned on the front of the newspaper and the top levels of government. And there have been a series, maybe not as well documented as that, and certainly our political system has given rise to a lot of people to question how the Americans are behaving these days. I get emails from my colleagues around the world saying, you've got over 300 million people. How did you end up with this group to choose from? And you know, there are no Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts amongst that group. And now, I'm not sure there's any one event, but there's been a series of events that have made the headlines that have caused people to question the ethics of our country, sadly.
Let me ask a follow-on question to that of the panelists. In today's world where we're seeing the integrity being challenged in the business world, what are some examples of truly ethical behavior of leaders? From a dean's point of view, from a vice chair's point of view, from a CEO's point of view, and from your colleagues' point of view. If we're asking for hints from the audience, what are some of those?
If I may, I was at Y&R New York when the Tylenol crisis happened. And some of you may remember that was a situation where some person who's never been caught was opening bottles of Tylenol and putting poison in and screwing the top back on. We had that account, and our public relations firm, Burson Marsteller, was called in, and they immediately set up a crisis war room in the agency. And the CEO of Johnson & Johnson was brought in within hours. They discussed it, and to his credit, he said, we have to pull all the product off all the shelves across the whole country. Even though it was in just a few places, he pulled all of the product off the shelves. Everybody said the brand is dead. You'll never see Tylenol again. But within a matter of weeks, they came out with a new bottle with those infuriating tops that now everybody has. But now the brand is as strong as it ever was. And I think that's an example of what you were saying, Bill, that there are people out there that do rise to the highest standards when necessary.
Yeah, and I think, Bill, in a business like ours, I mean, you know, we have to make choices every day around who we serve and whether or not, you know, this is a client that we feel is of, you know, the appropriate risk and reputation for us to serve. And so I think, you know, it's always difficult to walk away from a client, particularly if they've been a longstanding client. But I think in our business, it comes down to, you know, saying our reputation is above everything, our people are our most important asset. And, you know, I know personally I've had to fire clients and where they've mistreated our people and said, you know, we just can't accept this. We will not put our people in harm's way, given the environment here, and we can no longer serve you. And, you know, in some cases they move on and they go to that next firm next. Okay, we can find someone else. And in others, you know, they've come back and said, you know, you're right. We shouldn't support that behavior ourselves. They've made changes on their team, and we've continued the relationship. So I think having that courage to say we're going to walk away because it's not in accordance with our core values. We have 4. Their integrity, they're focused on our people, it's about valuing diversity and inclusion, and that's kind of the litmus test that we look at.
So I think that in both of these cases, someone has to take ownership. And Burke, I think it was Burke, who took ownership with J&J,
Yeah.
and the same thing that Deb is describing in taking ownership. One of the things that it's always something I keep uppermost in my mind, partly because of what I do and also what I teach, is that board members have a fiduciary duty to do care. And that fiduciary duty says, pay attention. In other words, keep your eyes open to what's going on, which sometimes doesn't happen. It means gathering evidence, gathering information, becoming informed, doing everything you can to try to make a better decision eventually by gathering information and processing it. It's also seeking advice, seeking counsel. That's why so many of the reforms allow audit committees and allow others to be able to get outside counsel or to get counsel from a wide range of sources. And in doing that, then to make a reasonable decision, which is what's made with J&J and other cases as well. And in some ways, what I think bothers us is when we don't see people who have that responsibility and should take ownership for it, not paying attention, not gathering information, not seeking counsel, and not making, if they can, a timely decision. We all understand that sometimes you can't make a timely decision. Well, you can try to explain to people why that is. But you know, I think that that's what we look to as our leaders in dealing with this wide variety of things that we can't all prevent. But when we've come across one of these, we can step up and take ownership of it and try to resolve it.
Well, and I think a term that is a really important one as part of the taking ownership is having courage.
Yeah.
Being courageous and,
Yeah.
and not being afraid to do that thing that might be unpopular and or really hard.
As dean, I had a number of events, and I ended up spending more time with university council than I really wanted to. On the other hand, what happened was a developing of a relationship with council where I went to them in many cases in an earlier phase. I didn't wait until we got to the end of something and ended up trying to prevent things from happening because I could see that there were some things, paying attention, seeing some things that were happening, and they knew they were good at resolving issues. They didn't have to be legal issues. They just had a lot of experience in resolving issues and thinking of alternative ways to try to move forward. And so I think that's what we expect of our leaders. We expect them to sort of be hands-on, take ownership, and then go through a very deliberate process to come up with the best answer possible. Now, that may be too high a standard, but we should aspire to that.
Boy.
Isn't there some rule about not talking about politics and religion in most organized?
I think this is a capital allocation question.
Yeah.
The board has responsibility for this kind of an issue. And at GE, it's the Governance and Public Affairs Committee that used to be, the Public Affairs used to be headed by Sam Nunn, who was a very tough, straightforward type person. So one side is the decision-making process to make sure that it is being vetted and vented with people within the company and elsewhere. I mean, part of this goes back that there were other parts of our society that could continue to make contributions. Labor unions being a major one that is brought up by business interests. So that was how it sort of came about to some extent. The other part of it is making sure that it's disclosed. And the GE sustainability report describes this, the amounts. You can see a listing of who got what. And that's a very important type of thing. Now, we also know that there are other ways that money can be given to other organizations that, like they operate almost like PACs, and they don't have the same kind of disclosures. But this is an issue where I believe where a company has to take responsibility, and the board has to take responsibility because of all the constituents, all the people who are connected to that company. If you take all the people who are connected to GE, it's not just the employees, it's the customers, it's 2 and 3 stages removed. And it's very important that this be vetted and vented in the appropriate forum.
We have unfortunately come to the end of our time that you've allocated for this conversation, and I'd like to ask the panel members if they might very briefly wrap up their thoughts about this evening. Gary, if we could start with you.
Well, I think this has been an enlightening evening for me, just listening to my fellow panelists. It is a very difficult and complex issue. And as I try to make clear, it's an issue that has different shades in different parts of the world. We have a set of ethical standards that are legislated by our government that we all try to comply with for the most part. But they don't necessarily translate in all places in the world. We have to be careful. We still have to conduct our affairs in accordance with the American laws if we're an American-based company. But sometimes that's hard to do. In a competitive situation, you're dealing with other companies that don't have those restrictions, and it's hard. But we keep trying.
Yeah, I'll just maybe close with a couple statistics and then maybe a term that I'll leave you with. So we do survey clients, and a recent survey that we did indicated that 87% of business leaders identified reputational risk as their most critical strategic risk. And of those that identified reputational risk, 55% stated that ethics and integrity risk were the most likely driver of reputational risk. So, I think this is always going to be an area of tremendous emphasis. We actually do have a term that we use at Deloitte. We call it ROE, and it's return on ethics. And I think we really do believe that the ROE that I'm talking about versus the usual way we think about ROE, but that return on ethics is one that it may be hard to calculate, but that it is invaluable, and particularly for any of us who work in businesses where our reputation is everything. It's just something we're going to have to continue to have tremendous focus, emphasis, and passion around going forward. It's going to continue to be driven by the tone at the top, by the culture of the organization, and by having those processes and systems in place that are going to help monitor how well we're adhering to what we say are our core values and what matters most to us.
I think most organizations aspire for high performance and high integrity. The setup that Bill gave us mentioned the kinds of pressures that are on businesses today. I think those are real.
Yep.
And as we sit here, we're going to see some of the effects of those unfold. It was mentioned about activist investors who are very active today. And they're institutional investors like a CalPERS, as well as other kinds of hedge funds and private equity funds and so forth. They argue that they're there for the long term. That is yet to be observed as we watch these all unfold. But the pressure is real. And they're also narrowing the measure of performance from earnings to revenues, now to margins, which basically makes the focus much sharper and much more intense. The same thing happens with compensation plans are now tied to operating performance. That comes about because of, say, on pay and various movements in corporate governance by major players to try to say, if you're going to earn these very large salaries, you're going to have to tie it to your performance, not to the behavior of the market generally, but basically to your performance. That is happening in some of the initial studies that have been done out of some of the corporate governance centers have said the say on pay, the advisory vote, is having an impact on having compensation tied more to operating performance. That puts more pressure on the firms. And we may see that in terms of other kinds of behavior somewhere along the way. Earnings guidance. Many companies dropped earnings guidance around the time of the fiscal crisis because they couldn't see the horizon. Earnings guidance has been coming back. And this was an example that Gary gave about once those numbers are out there and the company has put the numbers out there, that increases the pressure on the management of that company to meet those numbers and have to take responsibilities for those numbers. We see the global market slowing down. We see technology racing. I mean, what's happening on the technology side, I see it within GE, is a revolution that's taking place. That's going to put more pressure. The same thing is true of organizational changes. I'm seeing much more of the development of shared service centers. That takes out of the hands of local managers paying for services and paying people and so forth, and basically means, again, the targets are going to be higher, are going to be harder to meet or have more pressure to try to meet those. And then the side of high integrity. We want companies to have high integrity. There is a price we pay for that, but we want that price because we believe that that's in our social contract as well as in our public good. But I think as Bill mentioned at the beginning, which was quoted in this article in Forbes, we are seeing evidence of people cutting corners, omitting information, doing things that are at one level maybe perhaps minor until they become major, like was mentioned with Volkswagen. But you know, those kinds of things are going to take on more significance as we go through this period of more pressure for performance. So I think what we've been trying to wrestle with tonight are the important issues. And they're going to be the issues we're going to see play out over the next couple of years.
I found most striking in the conversation tonight, especially the answers from the audience that were given by the panelists, that there is a form and a format to discuss ethics. So when it comes time to have that conversation about ethics in your organization or wherever you are in your daily life, I would call to your attention the fact that there has been a very good definition, articulation of the format, both the format in the corporate environment as well as in the board environment, as well as in the global environment. So all hope is not lost on the ethics front. And I do want to appreciate all of you being here tonight. Thank you very much. And I thank the panel very much also.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. And thank you very much, panel. Terrific panelists, keen, insightful. Bob Syringa, thank you for your keen observations. It's always fun to get a look inside a company like General Electric, especially when you're looking inside the boardroom. And Deb, so it's great expansive experience across so many companies. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. And Gary, your global perspective was invaluable. Thank you very much. Well done, panel. And Bill, and let's give them another round of applause. And thank you here in the audience for your keen and challenging questions. You helped the conversation occur as we were hoping it would. And thank you for those of you who are participating on the internet, wherever in the world you may be. Thank you for your attention to what we're doing here. And a special thanks to the student volunteers who are spread here and there around from Net Impact, who helped us, as I described it earlier, a small herd of cats into the theater. These proceedings will be posted on the Institute's website shortly. The website is in your program as well as some other information, so don't forget to take that with you. Thank you all once more for your participation in this important dialogue, and we do believe it is an important dialogue to keep going, and for your investment in the promotion of ethical leadership in our businesses and in our economy. Let's be sure to keep the dialogue going. Please visit our website now and then just to see what's being talked about and add your contribution. Rants are invited. That's fine. Now, please join us in the lobby, right outside these doors for a reception with some appetizers, some liquid refreshment, and yes, indeed, some more dialogue. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I'll see you there.